Hello, my name is Jeremy. I'm going to be reading from NSCA's Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning, third edition. I'm going to be reading from page 111. This will be chronic adaptations of acute cardiovascular responses to anaerobic exercise. Chronic resistance training reduces the cardiovascular response to an acute bout of resistance exercise on a given absolute intensity or workload. Short-term studies have shown that resistance training results in adaptations that blunt the acute increases in heart rate, blood pressure, and double product caused by the resistance training workout. In addition, male bodybuilders have lower systolic and diastolic blood pressures and heart rates during sets of 50 to 100% of 1 rep max performed to momentary muscular failure than both sedentary and lesser trained men. Bodybuilders' peak cardiac output and stroke volume are significantly greater than those of powerlifters, demonstrating that stroke volume and cardiac output may be greater per absolute workload as a result of training. It is thought that these adaptations result from a decreased afterload on the left ventricle, then in turn increases cardiovascular output and decreases myocardial oxygen consumption. Lastly, oxygen extraction is generally not improved with resistance training using heavy loads and low volume. It is enhanced to a greater extent with continuous aerobic exercise, or perhaps slightly with resistance training program using high volume and short rest periods. Left ventricle, right ventricle, left ventricle. Ventilatory responses to anaerobic exercise. Ventilation generally does not limit resistance exercise and is either unaffected or only moderately improved by anaerobic training. During resistance exercise, ventilation is significantly elevated during each set, but this elevation is even greater during the first minute of recovery. Ventilations in excess of 60 liters per minute have been reported, and the rest interval length had a large effect such that short rest intervals, 30 seconds to 1 minute, produce the most substantial elevation. Training adaptations include increased tidal volume and breathing frequency with maximal exercise. With some maximal activity, however, breathing frequency is often reduced while tidal volume is increased. It appears that such ventilatory adaptations result from local neural or chemical adaptations in specific muscles trained through exercise. Additionally, improved ventilation efficiency, as characterized by reduced ventilation equivalent for oxygen, the ratio of air ventilated to oxygen used by the tissues, has been observed in trained versus untrained individuals. Compatibility of aerobic and anaerobic modes of training, page 112. Combining resistance and aerobic endurance training may interfere with strength and power gains, primarily if the aerobic endurance training is high in intensity, volume, and frequency. Callister and colleagues showed that simultaneous sprints in aerobic endurance training decrease sprint speed and jump power. Possible explanation for this less than optimal power development includes adverse neural changes and the alterations of muscle proteins and muscle fibers. In contrast, most studies have shown no adverse effects on aerobic power resulting from heavy resistance exercise, despite the expected cellular changes caused by the type of exercise. Although a recent study has shown that added resistance training can hinder VO2 max improvement. Interestingly, Kramer and colleagues reported that women who performed both resistance exercise and aerobic endurance training had a greater aerobic development than those who performed the aerobic endurance training alone. Such data have encouraged some athletes, distance runners, to add supplemental sport-specific resistance training to their total training regimen. The physiological mechanism involved in such responses to simultaneous training remain unclear, but the stimulus to the muscle fibers related to alterations in neural recruitment patterns and attenuation of muscle hypertrophy. Such adaptations may result in overtraining. Other potential factors may include inadequate recovery between workouts and residual fatigue from aerobic workouts during resistance exercise. One study of this potential incompatibility was conducted by Kramer and colleagues. They used 3 months of simultaneous high-intensity strength and aerobic endurance training under 5 conditions, with a combination group that performed both resistance and aerobic endurance training, a group that performed upper body resistance and aerobic endurance training, a resistance training only group, and an aerobic endurance training only group, and a control group. The S group, that is resistance training group. The S group increased 1 rep max strength and rate of strength development more than the C group, and C group is a combination group. In addition, maximal oxygen consumption improvements were not affected by the simultaneous training, almost identical improvements in 2-mile run times. Thus, no overtraining state for aerobic endurance was apparent. So the body will adapt to what you do it. If you're trying to get type 2 muscle strength and power, if you're doing muscular endurance or aerobic stuff, then your body wants to adapt to that too, and it's hard to have both to get really good at one and still have the other. You become average at one and average at the other, but they kind of go hand in hand, but at a certain point you have to get real specific on what you want to actually improve that will help your event or competition. So too much aerobic training for strength athletes, sprint athletes may not be good, because you may lose the type 2 muscle fiber adaptation, which you need those to be super strong and super fast and explosive, and you don't want them to become slow by doing slow training, which is aerobic training. A fascinating finding was the changes in the muscle fiber size of thigh musculature. The transformation of type 2X to type 2A fibers was almost complete in the S resistance training group and the C groups. That's the combination group. The UC group, upper body resistance and aerobic training. The upper body resistance and aerobic training and E groups who perform only interval training had about 9% type 2X fibers after training. This indicates that heavy resistance training recruits more of the type 2X fibers than high intensity aerobic endurance interval training. In addition, a small number, less than 3%, of type 2A fibers were converted to type 2C fibers in the aerobic training group. The combined group increased muscle size only in type 2A fibers, while the S group, this group is the resistance training only group, while the S group demonstrated increases in type 1, 2C, and 2A fibers. The lack of change in the type 1 fiber area and increase in type 2A fiber area in the C group, again is the combination group, appear to represent a cellular adaptation that shows the antagonism of simultaneous strength and aerobic endurance stimuli, since strength training alone produced increases in both type 1 and 2 muscle fiber areas. The E group showed decreased size in type 1 and type 2C fibers, presumably due to higher observed cortisol levels. Type E group, aerobic endurance training only. Type E group showed decreased sizes in type 1, 2C fibers, presumably due to higher observed cortisol level and reduced testosterone, and their physiological need for shorter distances between capillary and cell to enhance oxygen kinetic. Previous studies have shown decreases in muscle fiber size during aerobic endurance training. We had 9 minutes. See what else we got. The majority of studies used untrained subjects to examine the effects of simultaneous high-intensity resistance training and aerobic endurance training. Several studies that have shown an incompatibility used 3 days a week of resistance training alternating with 3 days a week of aerobic endurance training on 6 consecutive days, or 4 to 6 days a week of combined high-intensity resistance and aerobic endurance training, thereby lending credibility to the suggestion that overtraining could have played a role. when both modalities are performed during the same workout, yielding a frequency of 3 days a week with at least 1 day off between workouts, the incompatibility has not been shown as frequently. An exception was a study by Sale and colleagues who showed that training 4 days, 2 days of resistance training and 2 days of aerobic endurance training per week was better than training 2 days combined resistance training and aerobic endurance training per week for increasing leg press 1 rep max, 25% versus 13%. These studies show that increasing the recovery period between workouts may decrease the incompatibility. Power development appears to be negatively affected more than strength during concurrent high-intensity resistance and aerobic endurance training. Heikkinen and colleagues reported similar dynamic and isometric strength increases following 21 weeks of concurrent training of resistance training only. However, the resistance training only group showed improvements in the rate of force development, whereas concurrent training did not match this increase. Kramer and colleagues also showed that a resistance training only group increased muscle power, whereas a combined group did not. The resistance training only group also increased peak power in upper body and lower body tests, while the combined group did not. It appears that power development is much more susceptible to the antagonistic effects of combined strength and aerobic endurance training than is slow velocity training. Lastly, the sequence may play a role in the magnitude of adaptation. Leverett and Abernethy examined lifting performance 30 minutes following a 25-minute aerobic exercise workout, found that the number of repetitions performed during the squat was reduced by 13% to 30% to 36% over 3 sets. Cool, so we'll leave it there. That was page 112, compatibility of aerobic and anaerobic modes of training, right? To page 114. Cool. See ya.